Hello, my name is Cindy Scott Houseman, and I'm the owner of Cantrell Gallery in Little Rock, Arkansas, along with my mother, Helen Scott, and my husband, Clark Houseman. We have been in this business for over 50 years, and we've had a really long-term relationship with our guest speaker here today, Barry D. Lindley of Washington, D.C. We've represented Barry for over 20 years, and we're just so happy that he's willing to share his thoughts and insights about his art and techniques and travels and you name it. The focus is, of course, on our current featured exhibit, Into the Woods, which continues through March 5th. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Barry, and we want to thank each of you so much for being here. Welcome, and I'll let you take it, Barry.
Okay, Cindy, thank you. Let's see, will I capture the screen at some point, or? Thanks to all of you who are joining. I see more and more that I didn't get to mention, the Salvaggios, Monisons, and so on. One part that I really miss about art is being able to greet people at an exhibition like this and see them face to face and talk about the work. So this is a first for me to try to do it this way. I hope, if you haven't already, that you'll take the time to watch the video tour of the installation that's posted on the gallery YouTube page. I think Cindy has sent around the link to that as well. And if you haven't watched it yet, try to view it after we finish here. It's maybe 5 minutes long, something like that. It's not long, but for really good viewing, if you know how to do this, I suggest you screencast it to your TV, or you can, if you have a smart TV, go to YouTube and search for Cantrell Gallery. It'll take you to their YouTube postings, and you can select it there and see it on your TV, so you see it, see the paintings a little better. In addition to thanking all of you for stopping in, I want to thank Cindy and Clark and Helen for being such good friends and helping promote my work, and for arranging the exhibition. A gallery exhibition is, as many of you know, actually it's a sort of work of art in its own right, because the work needs to be selected, pieces are put in juxtaposition to each other, and people see them along with other people. And so it's a whole new dimension to the work. I remember the first time I had a painting hanging in a gallery. It was in a group show, but nonetheless, what a thrill it was, because it's like watching your kid at graduation or something like that. The work takes on a new dignity and new meanings, and so it's a very gratifying part of being an artist. And thanks again to the folks at Cantrell Gallery. My plan for this talk is to give a little bit of an overview, my approach to art, the concept behind the show. I'll talk a little bit about my process. I won't go into that a lot, but there'll be time for questions at the end, and if people have specific questions, I'll be glad to talk about them. Those of you who know me know I'm easy to get talking endlessly about stuff. And after talking about the process, I've selected some of the works to talk about it in a little bit of detail. These aren't necessarily the best works of the show, but they illustrate things, and we'll pass on to works that I haven't featured in this way at the end, or if you have questions that are answered better by looking at a specific work. Please ask questions if you want. You can raise your hand or enter a chat, and Cindy and Clark will help me keep track of those. And if, I may need to defer them, but I'd be glad to try to address issues that arise as we go along. About this show, I'm sort of known in a way for being a painter of faraway places, because I've traveled a lot and tried to make art in connection with each place I go. My last trip like that was to Antarctica 2 years ago. And for the year after that, I did mainly just oil paintings about that trip. And I finished a suite of 25 oil paintings about Antarctica. Half of them are now in the show is open just concurrently with this one at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center in Bethesda. But at the end of that, I was feeling desolate and treeless. And I joked to friends also, I'd run out of white paint. And so I longed to get back to one of my enduring loves, which are woods and waters, and especially trees. And so I decided to plunge into the woods, as it were, and do more work of that sort, and work that could then eventually make this show, which we called Into the Woods. We actually were thinking about the title before Stephen Sondheim's death brought him back into the spotlight. But it's sort of a nice echo of that and a way to pay tribute to that very fine artist. Any of you who haven't seen the new West Side Story, by all means do it. You know, mask up carefully, go to the theater, do it. It's a wonderful thing. And Sondheim's musical Into the Woods is also going to be presented in April, I think, in Little Rock at the Arkansas Repertory Theater, so that you can pay homage to Stephen Sondheim then. I'll share my screen for a moment before I talk about the process, but let me share my screen and start with this painting as the background. This painting is called Cedar Creek Below the Falls. I'll maybe talk a little more about it later, but the primary concept on this painting was to get something as a feeling of being in the woods, in this case alone. I love to walk through woods. We're fortunate even here in the middle of the city, literally next door to our apartment is a ravine which leads into Rock Creek Park. And so I often walk in the woods. Sometimes I'm on a mission just to get my step count up. Sometimes I may be interested in, watching the birds. Sometimes, often I'll take along a sketchbook, maybe do some drawings, or sometimes just sort of enjoy the feeling of almost meditation in the woods. I've learned of a practice which is, I guess, becoming common, called forest bathing, which is really meditation in the woods, to try to incorporate the sounds, the smells, the feeling, the breeze, everything, and sort of settle into a nice meditation there. And that feeling echoes with me. And so I hope that this whole exhibit shows my feeling for the woods. In terms of my process, first of all, I want to make beautiful objects. Let's see, Cindy, am I on the screen, or do I need to do something to?
You're on.
Okay. first of all, in terms of process, I want to make beautiful objects. I plan carefully and strive for a lot of underlying accuracy of everything I paint. But I want my paintings actually to look as if they were painted very spontaneously and in an unlabored fashion. One of my idols in that sense, of course, is Sargent, who had a gift for thinking that he must have done it with just a few strokes, whereas, of course, a lot of work underlies that. I love my materials. When I've taught, I like to encourage students to immerse themselves in their materials. And let's see, are people seeing me on screen or?
It's you.
Okay. I know what I'm doing here. Excuse me a second. I just want to get back to getting a little image here where I can see what people are seeing. Okay. This is a quarter sheet of watercolor paper. If we zoom back, you'll see the size of it. It's a 100% rag cotton, acid-free. It'll last centuries if you don't get it too moldy or something like that. But it's a nice object in itself. It's got a nice stiffness to it. You can hear a little bit of the crackle of it. That's part of the due to the sizing. It has a nice texture. And even in this case, it has a nice neutral smell. Now, this is Fabriano paper. If I were using Arches watercolor paper, you'd have a totally different smell, because when Arches gets wet, it smells like a wet dog, which is only one of the reasons using Fabriano. I usually use Kolinsky brushes. Let's see, here's Kolinsky is a kind of really it's a sable, but it's actually almost a weasel. You see that the brush, when it's dry, it's just like a little bit of a mop. Nice thing about it is if I dip it in some water here and just sort of flip the water away, it comes to a very nice point. So even with a fairly large brush, you can do almost any size shape. And I like to use the largest brushes possible. And occasionally use a special purpose brush. And this particular brush is called a dagger. And again, if I put it against the white here, you'll get a better idea of what it's like. It has it's almost a flat brush, but with the one edge that makes a point. It's a very versatile instrument for doing things like trees, because you can make such a variety of types of lines. My standard palette is shown here. The paints around the edge, the mixing area in the middle. I arrange them according to the color wheel. The cool colors on the right, warm on the left, through the yellows on the top. And I always use professional quality watercolors. You can't experience the full delight of watercolors medium unless you use good quality paper and paint. Brushes are great. That actually you can make pretty nice and interesting marks with almost anything, even with a stick you pick up off the ground and chew the end of, you can make interesting marks. But the paint and the paper you have to be careful with.
Hey, Barry.
Yes.
So what determined, you mentioned, good quality materials, and I think some things it's easier to understand what makes a good quality versus another. You mentioned the paper, for instance, but what makes a good watercolor what makes good watercolor versus poor watercolor paint?
Paint. Oh, you look for water. It's usually labeled as artist or professional. Certain brands are pretty reliable. These aren't the only good brands. My favorite brands are Daniel Smith, M. Graham, and Winsor Newton. These companies all have the finest quality pigments put up in a good medium. They have a long reputation for quality. So first aspect is the pigment load and using genuine pigments. The so-called student grade watercolors usually use cheaper pigments, and instead of say cadmium red, it'll say cadmium red hue, which is a tip, and may have a lot of filler in them to make the paint go further. And with transparent watercolor, you get what you pay for, basically. The professional watercolor will give you a lot more color than the cheap watercolor. And so even if it's more expensive, the result is really worth it. So you look for a reputable brand. It should be labeled as artist quality or professional quality. And generally speaking, they should indicate the chemical designation of the pigment on the tube and be single pigment. In the question and answer session, I can go into more of what that means if people are interested. Okay. Let me stop here. I usually will try to do some sketching on site at least. I usually will carry a little sketchbook like this and make really quick sketches, make some notes in it. I pulled out a couple of these. Here's one where I was, there we go, indicating basically the light and dark and a few of the linear features of a little stand of trees in a marshy field. If I'm on a real painting trip, I'll make a special sketchbook for the trip. Here's my sketchbook from Antarctica. And then in it, let's see. And this, for example, here standing on the deck of the ship, I was trying to get the outline of the icebergs, and it doesn't show up well with this video, but a little feeling of almost the pinkish haze in the morning sky, and that close to the pole in the south.
Barry, how often do your sketches, or what percentage of your sketches turn into, you know, full-fledged paintings?
Oh, boy, you know, 10%, 5%, something. It'll get a little closer to that maybe. Here are penguins, drawing literally sitting on the rocks next to the penguins. I was tempted to maybe drop the sketchbook into the penguin dung, which coats everything. I decided not to. And here's a color study from the ship, looking at what's called Deception Island. That's a volcanic island, so it's actually warmer, so you see much more bare rock. But here I especially wanted to get some of the feeling of the low clouds and something feeling of the color of the rocks and the vegetation. So I'll start with materials, study materials like that. And then in the studio, this is my, let's see it best here. This is my studio planning book. And I'll start here, and then I will make a small study to design the concept for the final painting. This is actually one of the paintings in the show, which we'll come to in a moment.
Barry, David would like to know if a photograph wouldn't serve you better than a sketch, or just as easily.
That's a really good question. My advice to people who are taking photographs to painting for paintings is take the worst photograph you can, because the temptation to copy a photograph is very deceptive. A photograph, among other things, usually consolidates all the darks into basically just sort of black, and so unless you pull special tricks as a photographer, you don't really see into the darks the way you do when you study it in life. The camera freezes a certain perspective, which often doesn't really jibe quite with the way you think of the perspective when you look at objects. And so I find that painting from a photograph as the original source material is very unsatisfying and makes a weaker painting. I do take thousands of photographs, and I'll use those as reference then and say, if I'm trying to paint an albatross or something like that, I can study the albatross skimming the ocean, have a good feel for it. But it's never still long enough to do the drawing of it. So maybe use the photograph to refine my understanding of what the light dark pattern of the bird was, or things of that sort. So I use photographs as reference quite a lot, but I never paint primarily from the photograph. And when I use them, I always just use my own photographs. Along the way, before I actually start the painting, I'll experiment a lot with little color mixtures. I usually use maybe only 5 or 6 different paints in a painting. It'd be different for each painting, and so I will experiment with the single pigments and how they might mix to get the effects I want. Here's a practice sheet for a painting we'll see later called Beech Trees in the Forest. Here I was trying to get just the right feeling for the gray, smooth gray trunk of a beech tree. I make little notes about the paints I was using in my own code. Another practice sheet, you'll see the underlying drawing of a painting I never did on this. The paper costs enough that it's fun to reuse it. But we'll do little practice things of this sort to test color mixtures, what have you. Sometimes I'll paint totally on location. I'd like to do that, and if you don't do that some, I think you shortchange yourself and dry up the well for being a landscape painter. This is a painting done totally on location. Autumn tree study. It's in the show, and maybe we'll come back to it later some more. People sometimes say, "How long did it take you to make that painting?" And my stock answer is, oh, maybe 70, 75 years, because I've been, drawing or painting trees since I was a little kid. And every painting I bring all that experience to. The intermediate answer is, it took me a few days, or it took me a few months, because I've been thinking about doing the painting and been doing some preliminary design things and so on. In this case, it took me 3 hours. I was painting with a group I belonged to, and we showed up at 9 and painted until noon, and then did critique. And so I know in this case I did the whole painting, but of course it draws on lots of other resources. In the planning sketches, here's some more of the planning sketches for the paintings in the show. The first thing I'm looking at is to get sort of the skeleton of the painting, the main linear elements, the main light dark shapes. And so I draw a little picture field here, and then just with ink or pencil drawing something. In this case, I was going to use only 3 paints, and sure, I did a little trial mingling of those paints to see, will that work? We'll see that painting later. Another painting, this was old tree by the beach. Similarly, the thing that most attracted me, the concept painting, so to speak, was this gnarled old tree left close to a beach. I wanted to get a rosy glow, I said here, in the background, and trying out the paints. This is another painting from the show. Here I did a little more color in the preliminary painting to get, I wanted to get the autumn leaves in there. You'll see when you look at the final painting, I ended up turning the fisherman around and moving him upstream a little bit. And again, although the fisherman is only a few small strokes in the final painting, I want it to be right underneath. And so I've done some drawings over here to try to get a little bit of the feeling of what he might have been doing, how the casting was going, and so on. Another couple of sketches, and here's the preliminary sketch for the beech trees in the woods. And I want to look at this because when we see the later painting, we'll see that I moved away from the concept in here. The thing I like about this is the bold darks and the simple shapes. As I did the final painting, I wanted to open up the woods a little more. And so the final painting has a really different feel to it, even though it's based on this sketch. And I think I may come back and do the painting again to get back to some of that feeling.
Barry, there are a couple of questions related to your sketches. And if I don't read your question out for people that are posting it, it's because I either know that something's coming up that'll probably answer it, or I'm trying not to just read everything that comes through. One question was, do you have a similar, and I'm paraphrasing, but is your process similar when you are doing, when you're thinking about doing an oil painting, as far as sketching and planning and all of that? And then the second question has to do with, do you ever sell your sketches?
The second question, no, I don't sell the sketches. I sometimes, it's fun to look at my old sketchbooks because, they're nice there. I can always get a high quality print made of them, but they have kind of personal meaning for me. I guess, someday somebody else ought to have them. But, one of my idols is Milford Zorns, who gave a demonstration on his 100th birthday. So right now I'm living in the present. In terms of oil versus watercolor, a lot of the elements are the same. The same sort of preliminary work, same sort of planning. It's a very different medium because oil painting is basically additive. You're putting the paint down. It's generally speaking opaque. You can paint over things, cover things. The paint doesn't move as much. It's much more controllable. Watercolor has its own mind. You have to be able to move with it and work with it. And it's more nearly subtractive. That is, you start with the light of the paper and take away the parts of the light to leave just certain colors of the light. And the feel of working it, it's very different. Watercolors are executed generally, for me at least, much more quickly when you do the final execution. And there's kind of a liveliness to doing that, which is a good feel. That's why I love watercolor. Sometimes, though, I want the light to be a tangible thing that you're moving and molding. And then for that, the oil paint gives me a different feeling. So I'm sort of two minds about that. I love the feel of oil paint for some sorts of subjects. I love the process of watercolor painting. To move on to the show, I'm going to start with the gateway painting, as I call it. At least this is the painting that Clark put first in the video of the installation, and use it to illustrate my concept of what a painting is. This painting is called Pinnacle Pine 2. For me, a painting is, in the first instance, a reference to a particular place or occasion or ambiance. It gives you the illusion of being there, maybe at a specific time. This is at the Quarry Pond at Pinnacle State Park, across the parking lot from the visitor center. And those of you who are from the Little Rock area may well have stood on the same spot that the artist is standing here. I've seen that. And I hope that if you have, it'll give you the feeling of how it looks with the dark back in the old remnants of the quarry when the sun hits the pine tree and almost washes out the greens. So in the first sense, painting is a reference to some specific occasion, place, object, thing. Or for an abstract painter, it's a reference to some sort of abstract principle that you want to indicate. How does color emphasize mood? How can I create mood by using color? I'm going to refer to the mood by making an object. But along with being a reference to a specific thing, the painting, to me, should be also a beautiful physical object in its own right. That resolves some artistic problems, displays the medium, and is something that you can enjoy quite without reference to the specific thing. Seen just as an object, some of the issues I was trying to resolve here is how do you get the feeling of the extreme dark to extreme light? How do you get the feeling of the pine needles without being in there painting every little needle? How do you do it in a transparent medium as opposed to opaque medium where you can't cover over things? And I hope in all my paintings, and you really have to see them in real life to get the full appreciation. But I hope you'll see how much I like the way the paint may mingle on the paper. Here, I've sort of resorted almost to purples to get much of the dark, put a little warmth in the dark with the reds here, but it's sort of a limited sweep of color, basically. It's not very chromatic until you get into the brightness of the yellow, some of the pine tree. In the third instance, a painting has what I call a backstory. I keep thinking I should have a better word for it. A backstory is everything else about the painting. Why was it made? In whose hands has it been? What shows was it included in? Are there any special anecdotes about it? Anything of that sort? Maestro or maestra, I guess I should say, of the backstory, I think, is the recent exhibit by Kay Barron at Cantrell Gallery. Kay's paintings, which I have not had the chance to see firsthand much at all, but they look like beautiful objects, but they're also always so evocative, the backstory. You wonder what is going on in the painting, what thoughts does it inspire? The backstory on this painting is it's actually had a precursor, a very similar painting that I did a long time ago and displayed back when the Arkansas Repertory Theater had a program of art at the Rec. For each show out in the nice hallways they invite artists to hang works. So I'd done the painting, and a friend of a friend was coming through Little Rock, saw the painting and bought it and took it away. And so it actually went back to Georgetown in DC to live, where I didn't know at the time. But I love the painting, so I wanted to redo it. And so I redid this painting, actually a couple of years ago. And I had just finished it when the Washington Society of Landscape Painters was having one of their annual meetings. And that year we held it at the studio complex I'm in. And so I had a chance to present it for critique. And, I get appropriate comments, did this, oh yeah. But one person whom I admire a lot said, well, there's a problem with the bird. And I've edited the painting. Before I did the editing, this shadow here was much darker and had much more almost a rounded off square outline. And as soon as she said that, I realized that this was the eye of a bird and the beak down here. And once somebody says that, you can't unsee it. And so I edited the painting, so I think I've taken away that illusion, which could be so distracting. So until I mentioned it, it didn't occur. But to me, the backstory of this painting will always include the bird in it. And I tell myself now that that's one of the eagles from around Lake Momel that's casting its spirit over the quarry pond at Pinnacle Park. So let's move on through the show now. And again, ask questions. It's one way to stop me talking. Here's the October Fisherman. We looked earlier at the planning sketch for it. This is less bright in color. I think most of my photographs are pretty true. I think the original painting here is a little richer in color than this painting. But this is more or less traditional landscape. Here the fishermen's come through the woods to fish in the stream. The woods form an important part of the composition, but mainly as large shapes that are translated into realistic woods by indications of the trunks. The fly line here I've indicated very simply. It's a tiny thing in the painting, but actually helps move you across the painting. One of the things I was attracted to in thinking about the painting, which is based on a real scene, was the reflections, patches of reflections of the clear blue sky in what was basically sort of murky river water. Another fully elaborated landscape is here, these hay bales in Perry County. These are the Washita Mountains in the distance. The time is nailed down by the haying season, the color of the fields. The beginnings of some autumn foliage and the background trees. Here are the trees, little bits of woods here, play a role in the composition. They form dark shapes, which I hope are interesting, help contribute to the recession by linear perspective. The hay bales were one of the attractions, actually. The light, sunlight glaring off of the plastic wrap of the hay bales. And I've artfully arranged the hay bales to make an interesting rhythm by varying the distances and a trail back into the painting. So in both this painting and the previous one, trees play an element. In a fully painting like this, fully orchestrated, so fully elaborated painting like this, you can think of the various elements as being like the instruments in an orchestra. And a while back, I was sort of taken with, how can I express more some of the spirit of the trees and at the same time take advantage of the really special things about painting in watercolor. And so I use the orchestral analogy that if you think of a regular landscape painting as being like a symphony or something like that, where you have the shady massive trees on one side as the strings and the sunlit on the other bank of the river is the brass, and the flute is the little patches of sky reflected. During a symphony, often there's a cadenza, a time where the soloist steps out, the rest of the orchestra goes quiet, and the single instrument then does a sort of little virtuoso performance. Much more limited resources than the full orchestra, but a full display of the personality. And so I set myself the task of doing like cadenzas from landscape paintings. And I call them the tree cadenzas. If you think back to that previous painting, here's a mass of trees. Let's those trees talk on their own with the constraint of using only 3 colors of paint. Each of the tree cadenzas, I had the constraint of using 2 or 3 different paints only to get the full range. And so here I was having so much fun with the watercolor, using just these 3 paints. Watercolor on the right kind of paper will granulate, so you get these lovely little effects here. It's really tough to do that with oil. Of course, a master painter, I guess, can do anything with any medium, but watercolor as a partner lets you do all these things. So much fun, the accidents, and then the fun of the dancing of the brush strokes. Here. And so this painting had the particular constraint of a certain set of paints. I call it the sunset cops, because the trees are backlit with the warm sky behind, and I wanted to convey the feeling of sunset as well. Simpler yet, think of a maple tree. What's special about a maple tree? It's the way the main trunk may branch fairly early into subsidiary trunks. And here again, just the 3 paints, just letting it mingle and playing with the brush, just dancing with the brush. A stand of riverside pines, again, the same constraints, just the feeling. You can almost imagine violins playing the strong swooping notes, little flourishes, and very delicate harmony of colors. I think these cadenzas have a more contemporary look than much of my work, and I actually encourage people to think about framing them floating in the frame. The floating in the frame emphasizes that it's a special object in addition to an illusion. It also has a really contemporary feel, and no better place than, of course, than Cantrell Gallery to help you reframe something if you need. Another one here, these are spruce trees in Alaska. Here, I want you to feel the wind blowing off of Cook Inlet, the trees which actually have to grow with the wind. The very subtle chromatic character to give a little bit of the feeling of the bleakness of the north and the wind blowing off the sea. But spring, here's the violin takes another, of course, the lighter part of the spring birch trees in the spring. And here are the beech trees I showed the earlier study for. Here, moving back towards a little bit of the feeling of being into the woods. This was still done with the triad of simple paints. This moves a little bit more towards elaborating the whole picture field, so it's a little less of a cadenza. Tried to start working a little bit on the wonderful roots a beech tree makes. As a backstory, sometimes there's an implied narrative here, maybe for many people. How often have you walked past a beech tree in the woods and seen that somebody's defaced it by carving something into the bark? Or if you're in the mood, maybe the fact that somebody carved in Harry loves Sally here, you don't see as much vandalism as an act of love. Usually, each person would bring their own interpretation to the implied narratives of walking through a forest of trees like this. Here's a forest sunflower. These are smaller than our usual garden sunflowers. Here I wanted to get the sunlit patch of bright yellow flowers, but then the feeling of being able to think back in through the woods, the speckle of light off little bits of lint flying in there, what have you. The painting is more or less botanically accurate, which I always like things underlying to be accurate. But think how much fun I had in the background here. There's a partner painting which is not actually painting with the show to this painting. Then the last painting I'll dwell on before you move to questions about any of the others is October Walk in the Woods. Again, this is a triad. I showed earlier planning work for it. The feeling of being in the woods. This time I've introduced people. The implied narrative in a painting becomes a big part of the backstory of it. And here I have the parents with the child. And there's two other figures up here. Are they teenagers who don't want to be caught dead with their parents? Is another couple, what have you? What would have happened if I had placed the child between the two parents, or spaced the child further off, or a little bit further up the path, or trailing behind? All these implied narratives. This October Walk in the Woods. And I think with that, I'll make just a couple of comments, then I hope to deal just with your questions. Yourself says, say a couple of things at the end. One is that I'm going to have my cataracts out in a short time. It will be really interesting to see what impact that has on the color in my painting. So you're seeing here almost the last painting before I had my cataracts out. I want you to invite all the pictures are framed in the same style to help give unity to the exhibition. It's an archival style, so they're good frames. There are kinds of frames that you use in a group show as well. But many of them could be done in other ways as well. If you'd like to see what actually goes on in my studio, I also have a 7-minute video studio tour on YouTube. If you search for my name on YouTube, you can locate it, or email me and I'll send you the link. And then finally, I have a special deal. Anyone who buys a painting from the show, or even really wants it anyway, I'll make a little brief video with the backstory up until the time you enter it of that painting, a little bit about the way it's made. So that you can arrange that by, folks in the gallery can arrange it, or you can arrange it by emailing to me. It'll just be a short video. If I knew what non-fungible tokens were, I'd turn it into a non-fungible token for you. And with that, thanks for your careful attention. Here are the rest of the paintings in the show. Again, the ones I've highlighted are not just the best of the show, but highlight some of the things. I'll be glad to answer further questions.
Thank you, Barry. I think we've covered a lot of the questions. Let me look back real quick and be sure that there was something. I think early on, Robbie wanted to know if you had any tips for painting water.
Yeah, I love painting water. Actually, I haven't painted as much water in these as I usually do. Actually, there's sort of a dearth of skies too. That's why I did one sky painting that's in the show. With water, there are three keys. One is the reflections. First of all, get the reflections right. I have an article I even wrote on that, because there's some special things about reflections versus shadows on water that you need to get right to make the water read right. Reflections, find some way to indicate the plane of the water so it sits the way it should in the rest of the landscape, whether it's a boat on it or ripples on the top or leaves floating or what have you. Paint very loosely. Those would be the main tips for water. Let's see. Trying to see what's the best water example. Let's see.
Maybe the October fisherman.
Okay, before we move to that, here the water is just gray reflecting the sky, and yet it reads very well as the water. This is not actually hanging the show, but it's in the gallery. Before I go on with that, this illustrates the fun of playing with the rhythm of the verticals in trees. But let's see. Let me have to stop annotating to do that. Here, if we go to October fisherman, you see here that I've reflected the bank of trees here. Reflections are always less extreme in value and less saturated in color than the real objects. That's an important principle in reflections. Reflections has to be a little bit less dark, a little bit less light, and a little bit less colorful to be really true. So the fact they're reflections of the fisherman, the bank. Here, I just not elaborated the reflections. No, reflections are broken where the water is moving. You only get reflections where the water is smooth. And so the surface of the water tilts. And so it's only where it's tilted in a certain direction that you'll get the sky reflections. But the pattern of the reflections, the pattern of the rocks, all those things help make this river read really flat. And the flatness is important. In a situation like this, where you've got the strong angle of the sun, you'll have not only reflections, but also shadows of the fisherman. And so here the fisherman has a sort of shadow as well as a reflection. Other questions?
Yeah, there was one that just came in. Let's see. How Nan would like to know how your touch and texture have changed over time, both with oil and watercolor.
On my touch and texture?
Yes, touch and texture is how it's worded.
Okay. I think the longer I've worked with watercolor, the more I've learned to enjoy the stuff it does on its own. let's see, let me pull up this one. This is a painting where this is actually on fairly smooth board, but nonetheless, there's a little bit of texture. But here, the texture is conveyed more by the differences in hue or value, because there's no real depth to the paint. But I like to, you also here, there's nothing here that is actually a defined shape. You see, and yet it reads as trees with leaves, some sunlit, some dark. Let's see, let's try this old tree by the beach. Here, again, this is not quite texture, but what passes for texture in watercolor, of course, is to some extent how much you let the paper show through, or a lighter lower layer show through. So here I've used the big brush with just really loose strokes, a little bit of a spatter, actually. It's just not always a good thing. A little bit of spatter to get the sense of little things that are dancing in the sunlight. And again, the moving here. So the contrast between just the paint mingling and the brush strokes. In oil, I've usually you see more of the physical character of the paint. And I think that as I've painted over the years in oil, I think I let the physical character of the paint show through a little more rather than striving just to brush out things.
Okay, I think there seems to be a short break. I'm not saying everybody should leave right now, but I'm going to stop the recording. If you have more questions, please do go ahead and ask them. You can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can type something in. But I will go ahead and stop it since we've got a brief, stop the recording part of it, since we've got a brief break here.